All right. Awesome. With that being said, I'll go ahead and kick off everything for our fifth annual SCC demo round. So hopefully, as you guys have seen throughout the day, I am super duper hype. I love debate very much, and debate has changed my life. And I wouldn't be who I am without debate. And I think that going to GDS that first year and watching that demo round was like huge for me, watching Emily Grantham, Layla Saklu, all these like legends that came before me. It was super cool to see them. So I'm always excited to do this every single year. This moment wouldn't be possible, like I've said many times already, without every single volunteer, without every single student. So I'll always be very thankful to all of you guys. The motion that we will be debating this evening is in the chat. Oh, I already put it there. This house prefers benevolent dictatorships over underperforming democracies. On the proposition side, we have a few very great debaters. We have Ebenezer Oppia. Ooh, shout out Ebenezer. Let's go. We're hype. We have Hans Gebauer. Ooh, let's go, Hans. Go, 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 go. And we have Helen Wu. Let's go. Yeah, Helen. Special shout out to Helen. She is currently on the other side of the planet, but she woke up super duper early just to debate for you guys because Helen is awesome. So shout out Helen. We appreciate her a bunch. On the opposition side, we have myself, nonchalant, none too crazy. We have Sophie Rukin, woo, 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 woo. First ever varsity first place speaker award at After Nationals. Woo, go, go, go. Let's go, Sophie. And we have the GOAT himself. We have world champion Ryan Lafferty. Another super duper special shout out to Ryan Lafferty. Actually, well, first, Sophie is at dinner and she's debating. So shout out Sophie, loves debate, wants to be here for you guys. Ryan has been debating, so he just finished a full day of debating, and he is also here because he also, like all of us here, loves debate and wants to get back. So appreciate everyone a bunch. And we can go ahead and get started. With that being said, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to open today's debate with a speech not to exceed 8 minutes. Hear, hear.
One's dignity is not measured purely by their country's Freedom House Index score. It's measured by whether or not their basic needs are met. We are proud to propose today's motion. On framework, we are here to discuss two nuanced yet imperfect systems. So let's unpack the defining characteristics of each, beginning with underperforming democracies. Democracies make two promises to its citizens. First, to uphold the principle of consent of the governed through A, elections, and B, checks and balances. And second, democracies promise to provide essential public goods, which generally include things like national security, electricity, clean water, and healthcare. Thus, an underperforming democracy is one that fails to deliver on these promises. The United States is a really excellent example. Benevolent dictatorships, on the other hand, feature a concentration of authority in the hands of an individual or group. These rulers accumulate extraordinary wealth and power. There are no formal checks and balances. Pragmatism is law. While democracies feature elections to assure the public that their voices are heard, benevolent dictatorships, rather, implement policies to prevent uprisings before they even happen. Let me explain how. Benevolent dictatorships nationalize key industries and distribute the profits to the public in the form of development projects. Think things like infrastructure, healthcare, housing, food, and energy. Now, this isn't some fantasy that we've constructed to win this debate. It has a name in political economy literature. It's called the rentier model, and it's best reflected by countries like the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. The key to benevolence here is that military force is rarely used to squash protests because the public is satisfied enough with their material conditions. Without widespread dissatisfaction or desperation, opposition groups hardly ever get traction with enough of the population to pose a serious threat to the regime. We think that this is a fair framing of the round for two reasons. First, it honors the fact that these are nuanced political systems, each with their own benefits and drawbacks. There's plenty of room for clash here. And second, our characterizations are specific enough to prevent either side from strawmanning their opponents. Our framing gets to the heart of the debate: free societies that don't deliver for their promises versus paternalistic authoritarian states. Our first substantive argument is really simple. Your freedom is dependent on whether or not your basic needs are met. In this argument, I will analyze the most likely causes of democratic underperformance and engage in a critical analysis of how freedom is best measured. So what causes democracies to underperform? Most failures can be ascribed to at least one of the three following problems. structural inequality, corruption, and gridlock. On structural inequality, the uneven distribution of resources, opportunity, and civil rights that deprive specific populations of their basic needs. We see corruption when the government is unwilling to redistribute wealth or regulate corporations because politicians stand to benefit from their relationships with wealthy donors and power brokers. And finally, gridlock, which paralyzes divided governments, i.e., those with a conservative legislature and a liberal executive. Often these dynamics reinforce one another. For example, progressive parties in polarized democracies are unable to make lasting reforms to reduce structural inequality because the next Congress or president simply just roll back all of their progress. For example, the Biden administration's child tax credits reduced childhood poverty in America by 30%, but that progress was only temporary because Republicans took control of the House in 2022 and killed it. Childhood poverty went right back up to the levels they were at before. Note that a shifting balance of power is not a bug in the system of democracies. It is a defining feature opposition has to defend. So why are benevolent dictatorships comparatively better? First, a benevolent dictatorship does not suffer from gridlock because power is concentrated in the hands of a single entity. The second reason you prefer benevolent dictatorships is because corruption is integrated into the social contract rather than being a disruption to it. Now, I know that sounds really bad, but bear with me here, right? It's no secret that the leaders of rentier states use their control of key industries and the bureaucracy to enrich themselves. But these leaders share common interests with the public. For example, imagine a benevolent dictator announces massive development projects intended to improve transportation, energy efficiency, water sanitation, and the construction of 1 million new homes. But here's the catch, right? The guy owns the company that paves the roads. His cousin owns the power plant company. His brother runs the water desalination facilities, and his son is a real estate mogul. Yes, there is open corruption, but the interests of the public and the state are aligned. That is the defining feature of a benevolent dictatorship. It keeps the people fed and taken care of. So what is freedom then? Let's engage in that critical analysis. Is freedom really just the right to vote for politicians that will listen to big donors anyway or get caught up in a cycle of gridlock? How free are you if you have food assistance that your family depends on is cut? What good is representation if your congressman votes to kick you off of your health insurance? Or is freedom about the options that are available to you? If you define freedom as choice, recognize that the greatest restriction of choice is not the absence of elections, it's the absence of housing, healthcare, food, and clean water. Our second substantive argument is a little bit more big picture. Benevolent dictatorships are better suited for long-term planning. If anyone has a point of information, feel free to ask now.
Gridlock isn't a negative, it's a plus. The fact that politicians have to publicly build coalitions for policies is what prevents individual strongman leaders from passing fast but bad policies which backfire.
I'm glad that you're talking about speed here. I'm going to focus on how democracies are short-sighted. But what happens when democracies are structurally incapable of forming those coalitions that are necessary for good government? That happens in a polarized society like the ones that we're seeing all around the world today. And it's why democracy is backsliding, not improving. Thanks for your point, though. So our second substantive is about big picture. Benevolent dictatorships are better suited for long-term planning. Why is this the case? It's simple. Democracies are driven by short-term incentives. Democracies are structurally short-sighted because policy is tied to election cycles. Politicians prioritize re-election over good government. In effect, long-term projects are A, reversed, or B, outright delayed due to changes in leadership. We've already seen how the transfer of power from a blue Congress to a red one condemned another generation of American children into poverty. Climate change is another humbling example for democracies. Democracies are unable to address climate change for two structural reasons. First, the reversal effect, and second is NIMBYism. On reversal, the shifting balance of power prevents any potential climate progress. Trump just repealed most of Biden administration's clean energy tax credits. This is huge, guys. It matters because the renewable energy industry can't make a 5-year business plan if the subsidies are constantly changing. Every election is a rug pull for a world-saving industry. This ends up scaring investors, preventing an energy transition from ever taking place. NIMBYism, which stands for not in my backyardism, refers to the public opposition to much needed infrastructure upgrades. People like the idea of solar farms, for example, but not in their community. This often prevents local and state officials from permitting clean energy production. The same sentiment is what led Austria, Spain, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy to all pledge to abolish nuclear energy, mostly through referendums. Meanwhile, the UAE, a benevolent dictatorship historically dependent on oil, just finished construction of its first nuclear power plant. The nuclear power plant is part of a larger strategy to increase renewable energy's share of total power supply by 700% over the next 30 years. See, the UAE can look into the future and recognize that its oil reserves will eventually run dry. The government is using the trillions of dollars it raised from selling oil to diversify its economy and prepare for a post-oil market. Benevolent dictatorships aren't concerned with election cycles, nor do policy priorities flip every few years. Instead, the government commits to a consistent and long-term policy strategy. The West's short-term thinking is leading the world into a grim future where natural disasters, catastrophic famines, pandemics, and wars become more common, leaving us no choice but to propose today's motion. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for that excellent speech and would like to welcome the Leader of Opposition to open the opposition bench with a speech not to exceed 8 minutes. Hear, hear.
Okay, cool. Can you guys hear me? Because I'm on the roof of a building.
Yes, yes, we can.
Yeah, we're good. Okay, cool. Give me a second. Just making sure I have 8 minutes, right?
That is correct.
Cool. Okay, it's gonna be a little bit. Oh, sorry. I'll do the roadmap on time. This is not APTA. Sorry. 3 things I want to do in this speech. First, I want to talk a little bit about the framing and the model. Then I'm going to go into a few arguments from our side, and then I'm going to go into some rebuttal. Actually, rebuttal first. First, on the framing. First, we want to talk about generally what are benevolent dictatorships. We think the idea that side government gives you in this round is kind of idealistic. Even if everything that they tell you is inherently right, and these dictatorships are great, and everyone likes them, and they're very benevolent. We think at absolute minimum, these are probably short-termist places that, regardless of all of them, are systems of governments in which one ruler or small group has autocratic absolute control over power, which means limiting parties, politicians from certain areas being challenged, and limiting public gatherings and restrictions on free press, and all of that kind of stuff that we'll talk about later on in case. Secondly, what are underperforming democracies as a model? We think it's a political system with competitive elections, contestation, and some degree of civil participation that often suffers from gridlock, corruption, low trust, all that kind of stuff. But underperforming does not necessarily imply not performing, but rather maybe doing something slowly or maybe inefficiently. This looks like people struggling to apply for healthcare due to barriers and bureaucracy, but it still exists to some extent. Before I get into arguments, 3 points of rebuttal I want to give. First, proposition argues that democracies suffer from gridlock. We think this is true, but gridlock is good because faster policy is not necessarily better policy. The existence of gridlock forces governments to publicly build coalitions for the passage of legislation, which prevents the worst sorts of laws, ones which enable mass repression from being passed. No such checks exist in benevolent dictatorships because there's a lack of checks and balances just by the fact that it's controlled by a small group of people. Second, proposition argues that corruption is institutionalized in benevolent dictatorships, but corruption, even if it's initially benevolent or non-harmful, naturally is self-reinforcing. Once resources are concentrated in the hands of a small elite or oligarchs, those oligarchs gain power and leverage over the dictator. And over time, benevolent dictatorships become increasingly less benevolent because they're increasingly captured by corrupt special interests. In democracies, there's a way to stop this from happening. It's called elections. Highly corrupt politicians can be voted out of office, and politicians are afraid of that potentially happening. So there's a preemptive incentive against corruption in democracies, even underperforming ones. And third, Prop says climate change is a major, major problem, and democracies respond less effectively. But democracies are responsive to the people, and voters are increasingly concerned about the health of the environment. This means that there's rising political pressure among many democracies to pass environmental legislation. By contrast, there's no incentive to be environmental in a dictatorship because the dictator will never face the consequences of climate change since they're rich and can simply live in places that are insulated from the consequences of climate change. This argument probably applies to policies that are not only climate change and things that affect everyone in everyday life, like your healthcare or your ability to actually get around. That being said, our first substantive argument is on the principle of democracy. The thesis of this substantive is that people have an a priori principled right to democracy, even when democracy underperforms. It's first crucial to categorize that the state is a coercive actor. There are 2 reasons why this is just generally the case. First, the state passes laws which restricts people's freedom. This looks like telling you that you must be 16 and pass a driver's test to drive a car, or banning public nudity. Second, the state collects taxes which steal people's property, as your income is something that you gained by working and is your own property that is then taken. However, people do not control where they are born due to the birth lottery. I could have been born just as easily in Indonesia as I could have been born in New Jersey. This means people cannot explicitly consent to the state's authority. It is morally wrong, though, to coerce someone without their consent, irrespective of the outcome. For instance, it is wrong for me to steal your wallet and donate the money to charity, even though this produces a good outcome. This means the state commits a moral wrong by coercing people without their consent. Therefore, the state has a reparative duty to its citizens, or a duty to repair the moral harm that they caused. The right to participate in competitive elections solves for this and is the most appropriate form of reparation. This is because citizens vote for the party or candidate which supports policies they agree with, which means elections enable citizens to directly shape how the state uses its coercive power, for example, the laws in which the state enforces. This principle is morally important for three individual reasons. First, many policies implemented by the state are morally subjective. Maybe you support an expansive welfare state. Maybe you don't. Maybe you think hard drugs should be legal. Maybe you don't. There's no objectively right answer. Reasonable people have reasonable views on these debates, and there's no objectively correct view. This means people should have a right to democratically elect their leaders so the subjective preferences of the citizens can be aggregated and represented in the state's policies. Even if Prop's world is more utilitarian, for instance, even if their world is more economically prosperous, Prop's pathway to achieving those outcomes is morally unjust because Prop does not give people the right to control how the state uses its coercive authority. Second, fundamental rights should not be violated, even when violating rights maximizes total welfare. For instance, it would clearly be unjust to kill Diego and harvest Diego's organs to save people in need of organ transplants, even if doing so saved more lives on net. This is because rights act as a side constraint on the state. The state must respect people's innate dignity in order to be legitimate. Maybe Prop proves that a benevolent dictatorship passes better policies. Even if Op wins this clash, it is unjust to achieve these better policies by violating fundamental rights. You cannot instrumentalize people because it is wrong to use people as a means to an end. I'll take the point in a second. This is precisely what benevolent dictators do. Third, even if this argument does not prove a principled right to democracy in practice, Prop cannot deny that in practice people care about democracy. Benevolent dictatorships instill a deep and constant fear within their subjects. You are always afraid you could be jailed or imprisoned. You are constantly aware that the state possesses authoritarian power over you. Sure, I'll take the point.
Isn't it also true that human rights are somewhat subjective? For example, do democracies tend to treat healthcare as a human right?
So I think the question is more people need to determine their own subjective rights. If something is subjective, it's better to let more people make their own independent subjective decisions than to let one person do that continuously, because that's the most likely probability of coming to the right outcome. Our second substantive argument is on stability. The thesis of this substantive is that over the long term, benevolent dictatorships are more prone to regime instability than underperforming democracies. The first layer of analysis concerns civil unrest. There are two reasons why people are likely to be violent and cyclically discontent with their government on their side of the house. First, benevolent dictatorships are prone to mass protest and revolution because authoritarianism does not provide non-violent means for citizens to express dissent. For instance, dictatorships, even benevolent dictatorships, prohibit protests, do not hold elections, and suppress freedom of speech and press. This means disaffected citizens can only express their frustrations through violence. This also means it takes relatively little for citizens to be taken to the streets. This is, in times of economic hardship, it's just the only way that they're able to do this. And technocrats are unable to use this, or authoritarians are unable to use different rhetoric to make people sit home. Second, benevolent dictatorships are prone to succession crises. Dictators inevitably die, and when they do, the sudden power vacuum invites infighting among political and military elites. Dictators naming their successor does not solve the problem, because the named successor does not yet have the cult of personality, economic wealth, and political support of the dictator, so the transfer of power is still vulnerable to disruption, since power-hungry wannabe dictators can assassinate the successor or posture for power. This is especially true since for some of the people who notably did not like the leader that they had for 20 years, they don't want that to happen again, which means that they're unwilling to suffer through the next appointee. Conversely, underperforming democracies typically remain stable because people have non-violent mechanisms to challenge harmful state policies, like lawsuits, public protests, and the ballot box, even if they hate the leader. The second layer of analysis quickly is that benevolent dictatorships are less economically prosperous. There are a few reasons for this. First, benevolent dictatorships attract less foreign investment than democracies. Dictatorships operate a public policy black box. People have no idea what they're doing at any point in time, meaning people don't want to work with them. Comparatively, the democratic process, even when imperfect, is information maximizing. So people, multinational corporations, want to give them money because they know exactly what they're getting themselves into. Secondly, benevolent dictatorships are more extractive than underperforming democracies. The highest priority of dictators, benevolent or otherwise, is to stay in power and be good. This means that they're likely to be dependent on the security apparatus and do things along the lines of that, meaning they're less economically prosperous. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
I thank the first opposition speaker for an excellent speech and would like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver their rebuttal for the proposition. Hear, hear.
Cool. Am I audible for everyone? Can you hear me? Awesome.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Starting in three, two, one. I think it is a fallacy of people who live in the United States to presume that all democracies are good or that dictators are always bad. And the reason for this is quite simple. There is no principle when you're starving from the fact that you cannot eat food, right? There is no ability to actualize your rights in a proportional representation system when the majoritarian ethnic group systematically wins elections over and over and over again. Which is why I think it is important to discuss, number one, when these regimes occur, and number two, the likely ways in which they evolve into the future. So in this speech, I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to frame when these regimes are most likely to actualize. Second, I'm going to explain why democracies more often than not are actually unrepresentative of the majority of the people that they claim to represent. And thirdly, I'll talk about stability and long-term economic growth. Firstly, then, when do these regimes occur? I think we already framed to you in our first speech why it might be true that, for instance, benevolent dictators are few and far in between in the total number of dictatorships that exist across the world. But that is fine, right? Because that is what we're defending. And we think that overwhelmingly these kinds of regimes exist in instances where you have to have new regime formations. This looks like, for instance, post-colonial Singapore that was recovering from the ramifications of the British colonists existing in their colony, right? It looks like post-World War II Yugoslavia. It looks like post-Ottoman Empire Turkey or post-genocide Rwanda. What that means is that obviously these regimes do not exist in instances where democracies would have been the natural alternative, because it is overwhelmingly difficult to establish democracies in regimes where it is incredibly unstable, where people do not have strong institutions, where there is no pre-existing rule of law. And what that means is that obviously the majority of Sophie's case, which talks about the ideal types of democracies that exist in, for instance, developed Western nations, are just not the kinds of regimes we are likely to talk about. But second, why are these benevolent dictatorships extremely important in these instances? Because obviously, before you have strong institutions, before you have strong rules of law, when democracies are established, the overwhelming likelihood is that it takes extreme amounts of force and repression to be able to maintain these democracies over time, to be able to make sure that people can actually go to ballot boxes without there being massive amounts of voter suppression, to make sure that there isn't massive amounts of corporate capture from elites. And so that means that obviously these benevolent dictatorships are necessary, both because, number one, they need a strong leader to rally against to be able to have people to buy into these kinds of regimes. But number two, obviously you need strong centralization and strong forms of central power to be able to do things like set up schools, to be able to do things like have massive amounts of investment into industry. Sophie says that gridlock is good because it's good to take a long time to pass certain policies. But for instance, if you're Singapore coming out of colonization, or if you're Yugoslavia coming out of World War II, you do not have the luxury of time to be able to establish these things. And if it takes a long time, for instance, to make sure that your citizens have the necessary provisions for them to be able to survive, that's when things like violent protests occur. That's when things like the complete suspension of rule of law and coups occur, which is why obviously on our side of the house, when we explain that benevolent dictatorships means that the majority of citizens are okay with the conditions that they have, that obviously this is a preferable alternative to a democracy that is plagued with corruption and that is plagued with gridlock. And the second thing that I want to explain is just that a lot of the problems that Sophie describes that are inherent to like dictatorships are also inherent to really bad democracies. Like, for instance, they explain that oligarchs are likely to gain power, but on our side of the house, these kinds of benevolent dictatorships do things like intense anti-corruption campaigns, right? You can look at Singapore and you can look at Ataturk in Turkey for examples of these kinds of things. Whereas on their side of the house, democracies are obviously liable to things like intense amounts of lobbying or intense amounts of, for instance, politicians literally going and buying votes in places like India, where the kinds of accountability that occur in elections are very, very low. Whereas on our side of the house, there's obviously an incentive to make sure that corruption stays at an absolute minimum, both because you want your citizens to be happy, but obviously because if you are a dictator, it is very bad for you if, for instance, your elected officials are corrupt and actively working against you. Second thing that I want to explain then is why democracies are actually not representative of most of the civilians' needs. And that is number one, because of institutional design flaws. Like Ryan in his POI explains why coalition building building is often good in many instances, but this is obviously not true for two reasons. Number one, democracies can be first past the post systems, right? Which means that majority rules and it's a winner take all election. But obviously, this is very, very bad because if you capture 51% of the vote over and over again, i.e., like the BJP in India, that or like rural voters in the US, that just means that there's permanent people who get excluded on the ground because all you have to do is make sure that you maintain appeal to 51% of the voters, which means that there's often overrepresentation. Whereas in benevolent dictatorships, the very threat of coups that Sophie describes is very, very likely is the reason why you have an incentive to actually appeal to the least well off, because these are the people who are most likely to revolt and make your regime unstable. But second, if you do have like purely proportional or multi-party or parliamentary systems, this is obviously really bad because it means that small extremist minority parties, i.e., look at Israel or Italy, have the ability to capture elections even if they do not represent a majority of people's interests. It leads to things like unstable coalitions, or it leads to things like historical gridlock, like in, for instance, countries like Lebanon, which means that there's just overwhelmingly weak checks and balances. People trust the government less and less because the government fails its actual social contract to its citizens. It doesn't actually provide the resources they need, which is what Sophie describes as the principled responsibility of the government. So just don't think that principle stands when you're actually failing to meet the first order needs of your citizens, because people only care about having proportional representation when their bellies are actually full and their family members aren't systematically unemployed. But I'll take a point if there is one. Okay, great. Third thing that I want to talk about then is long-term stability, because I just don't think that it is the case that on either side of the house, the regime exists in the same form 20 years down the line, particularly as I have framed, because benevolent dictatorships are often required after long times of instability. What do I think this means? Number one, I think it is ops burden to prove that their democracies, which are often messy and unstable, do not actually devolve into things like anarchy or into things like military coups. And the reason for this is quite simple, right? Because on their side of the house, the same problems that they describe of having unstable leaders that people systematically dislike, about having massive amounts of public mistrust leading to violent uprisings, is the same, because people protest not because of the form of government they have, but because they're inherently dissatisfied with their government, which is why on their side of the house, you can look at many historical examples where new, nascent, unstable democracies often devolve into violent uprisings that then lead to military dictatorships and coups. Whereas on our side of the house, it is true that in every regime, there's going to be a certain amount of public dissatisfaction, right? But on our side of the house, number one, that's less because people are just satisfied with the conditions that they have on the ground. But number two, yes, there is going to be some forms of suppression of, for instance, the like ability to protest or the ability to speak out against the government. But even if that comes at the expense of some small personal freedoms, we say that is often good, because obviously having no government, having no rule of law is pretty bad for anybody, even if someone who is rebelling. We think that oftentimes people who are rebelling don't actually know what's best for them. Lastly, then, on economic prosperity, obviously their arguments for why you don't receive foreign direct investment are far worse on their side of the house for two simple reasons. Number one, if the government constantly switches back and forth or cannot pass policy, you do not have any stability to invest. But number two, on our side of the house, you know exactly who the leader is and you're able to negotiate with them for a lot easier. For all those reasons, very, very proud to propose.
I thank the deputy for that excellent speech and would like to welcome the deputy leader of opposition to deliver their response. Here.
'Okay, I'll do POIs in chat, please. Oh, wrong doc. Oops. Three questions in this speech. First, are benevolent dictatorships more stable in the long run than democracies? Secondly, is there a principled right to democracy? Third, where do you best maximize the general welfare and address existential threats like climate change? First, on regime stability. The main example from proposition is Singapore. You would rather live in Singapore than a failed post-colonial democracy. Maybe that's true. Maybe you find that persuasive. But almost everyone in this room agrees that you would rather live in a relatively weak democracy than an outright dictatorship that oppresses and abuses and represses its people, like Russia or modern-day Rwanda or modern-day Turkey. Ironically, two of the examples used at DPM. So the relevant question you should ask is, even if a benevolent dictatorship in theory is preferable to an unstable democracy, what is the risk of a benevolent dictatorship devolving either into a civil war, cf. Syria, or into a malicious dictatorship? And there is a very high probability of regime collapse on their side for 5 reasons. First, benevolent dictatorships may begin benevolent, but gradually become malicious over time. And this is for 2 reasons. The first reason is because power corrupts. Consolidating power in the hands of an individual autocrat who may initially intend to be benevolent inevitably results in that dictator gaining a god complex and a deep cult of personality, and growing deeply out of touch with the well-being and the interests of their people. Consequently, even a benevolent dictator eventually becomes malevolent as they become increasingly power hungry. But secondly, even if the benevolent dictator is perennially benevolent, their successor probably is not. And the reason is that the sorts of people that vie for power to succeed the benevolent dictatorship, like Lee Kuan Yew or like Joseph Tito, are typically people who are motivated above all else by an interest in power. And power typically selects for self-interested people who are willing to do whatever it takes to win out in the succession crisis, which means maybe opening government gets 20 years of good climate policy, effective economic governance, and relative political stability. They subsequently give rise to a bloodthirsty and brutal dictatorship, which even in imperfect democracy is clearly preferable to. Reason number 2, the risk of revolution is much greater in a dictatorship. Helen's response is that dictatorships are less prone to violence because a democracy is prone to coups, to revolution, etc. But the probability of violence is very low in democracies for 2 reasons. First, people have a non-violent means to air their grievances. Rather than protesting in the streets violently, which is risky and potentially causes your death, you can simply vote or lobby the government through public channels. But there are no such options in autocracies, which is why autocracies are far more likely to become involved in violence. But it's also because succession crises on their side mean that even a stable democracy is prone to collapse. And the reason succession crises happen, beyond the trivial fact that dictators eventually die, is because dictatorships derive power from the military, democracies derive power from the people. The reason why is that a dictator must always be What was, wait, is that a POI? Oh, I have been.
What the fuck was I doing?
Someone's unmuted. Hold on.
Can you mute if possible? Okay, I will resume. Where was I? Oh no, I've lost my train of thought. How very sad. Inevitably, the military loses faith in the dictator because the military realizes the dictator depends on the military for power. So even a benevolent dictator eventually becomes less benevolent over time because they have to extract more and more wealth from the population to pay the military to not coup them. But democracies don't have nearly the same degree of problem because the politician's foremost concern is not a military coup because there is a strong norm in favor of democracies, even in countries with weakly established democracies, because people often fought for and revolted for democracy. So the military would lose public confidence if it coups against the democracy. That means that militaries are more powerful on their side and the risk of economic extraction is greater. The final reason benevolent dictatorships are prone to collapse is because they are far more likely to devolve into civil war. Unfortunately for Prop, they have characterized this debate as mostly being about rentier states like the UAE or Qatar. Problem: states that depend on power for natural resources are prone to conflict and violence for 4 reasons. First, greed drives war. If you operate in a resource-rich country, warlords have strong incentives to start underground insurgencies which gradually gain power over time, like Iraq in the 1980s or 2010s, because resources are easily controlled and highly lucrative for those in control. So resource-rich dictatorships are highly prone to conflict. Second, natural resources cause small-scale conflicts that might happen on either side to become worse over time because natural resources can be weaponized by the insurgency to buy more weapons, to hire more soldiers, to expand the scale of the conflict. But thirdly, it's because if the dictatorship on their side is dependent on commodities like oil or gold or diamonds to maintain power, commodities prices are volatile. Think the price of oil collapsing by 90% in July 2014, or the price of oil skyrocketing in March 2022. Importantly, states which depend on whose power depends on resources are prone to revolutions when commodity prices collapse. That is when you can't finance the welfare state in Saudi Arabia. That is when the Sudanese government collapses in 2019 because Omar al-Bashir runs out of oil to support his people. Here's the key weighing. Opening proposition might be right that a dictatorship is preferable to a bad democracy, but a bad democracy is better than the sort of government which likely emerges long-term on their side. Even if you are fully convinced by proposition's characterization of benevolent dictatorships as preferable to bad democracies, that is not the real comparison. Benevolent democracy, autocracy is an illusion and inevitably fails. Question 2, principle. They say the right to democracy matters less than the right to basic needs like food or water. There are two problems with this argument. The first problem is that people have a revealed preference for democracy, even when democracy comes at the expense of basic rights. Why do you think people in Hong Kong risked their lives to protest for democracy? Or why Syrian revolutionaries were willing to be gassed to death by the Assad regime in the fight for liberalism? It's because life is more than food and water. Dictatorship is a violation of dignity. You live in constant fear even if your basic needs are met. And people crave a life beyond just basic needs being satisfied. They desire control over the state. They desire basic liberties being protected. Even if democracies do not perfectly protect people's basic rights, people ought to have dignity respected by the state, which is why the right to democracy exists prior to the right to basic goods. But secondly, this argument rests on an unreasonable characterization of what the average democracy looks like. To be clear, this is not a debate about you are a post-colonial country. Should you implement a benevolent dictatorship or should you implement an underperforming democracy? The question is, both regimes exist. Which would you rather live in? And crucially, you would rather live in an underperforming democracy because even the worst performing democracies almost always do protect fundamental rights, like the right to food or water. Why is that? Because even in the most ethnically captured, corrupt, gridlock democracy, violating fundamental rights is major political controversy because there is always a risk of people defecting from your party, and there's always a risk of angering moderates or causing people to lose faith in the moral backbone of your party, which means as a political party, even in a first-past-the-post system, the fear of mass opposition or revolt or defection against your party is what creates the incentive to provide basic needs. And furthermore, there's a bipartisan incentive to provide these sorts of rights because people are the least likely to demand a shift away from democracy towards autocracy when their basic rights are satisfied. All of this means that there is a right to democracy, and even if that right to democracy is imperfectly represented under our side, it is better to partially fulfill the right to democracy than completely violate it on theirs. Final question. Which regime better maximizes well-being? They say that politicians are short-termist, but autocrats are equally short-termist because they're always terrified of revolution, which means they also must focus on the immediate term to maintain power. But also, democratically elected politicians do care about the long term because they belong to political parties that care about their legacy, and because politicians themselves want to maximize long-term growth. You know why? Because voters care about long-term economic growth. So it is in politicians' incentive to care about long-term issues. They say extreme parties capture the parliament, CF Israel. But this is unlikely because most countries have proportional representation systems, and the median voter theorem establishes that the median voters' preferences are best captured by the political system. And gridlock might happen, but gridlock is good. Slower, good policy is better than fast, bad policy. An individual autocrat has imperfect information, which is why even if they get faster policy, that policy is more likely to violate rights and alienate foreign investment. Because we better establish growth and protect people's basic rights, propose.
Awesome. I thank the DLO for that excellent speech and would now like to welcome the third speaker from the proposition to close the constructive portion of the prop bench. Here.
Awesome. Just want to make sure everyone can hear me.
Yep.
In this speech, I want to go over three different questions. Firstly, on the question of underperforming democracies, and specifically, I want to talk about opposition's case here. I want to weigh whether or not it's more likely that an underperforming democracy is able to recover, stabilize itself, and maybe become a performing or good democracy versus the chances that a benevolent autocracy remains benevolent and actually appeals to like the material interests of people. The second thing I'm going to talk about is long-term stability, and the third thing, if I have enough time to get to it, is going to be on the principle and whether or not the principle is strong enough of a path to battle for them to win on. Firstly, in terms of underperforming democracies and their capacity to recover versus the chance that a benevolent dictatorship remains a benevolent dictatorship. The first thing I want to note here is that I think that the important thing to keep in mind here in terms of characterization is that underperforming democracies typically are on a trajectory to become sham democracies or more autocratic governments in general, right? Because of their specific capture by elites or special interests, right? So I think the definitive difference between a currently underperforming democracy on trajectory to becoming maybe more autocratic or authoritarian versus a currently benevolent dictatorship is that the difference is that currently benevolent dictatorships still have underlying incentive structures that are likely to persist even if there are changes in leadership, and I'll give reasons for why this is likely the case. The first thing to note, though, is I think harmful democracies are likely to develop into more autocratic governments with similar interests that created that instability in the first place. So if your government is backsliding because of a set of interests, it is likely that the next variant of that government with set interests, which is dissolved institutions, which has become comparably a lot more weaker and has less actual mechanisms to push back and influence that government, is likely to preserve those same negative externalities and interests that paved way for that government to backslide, that paved way for that government to underperform in the first place. The second thing I want to note, though, this is characterization that has been true across the entirety of Proposition Bench, is that benevolent dictatorships already have long-term incentives. You can look at all the analysis that Helen gives you specifically in terms of characterizing why exactly this is the case by looking at specifically the conditions at which these benevolent dictatorships are arising. But even if you don't buy any of that, notice that the mechanism of dissent that exists in these authoritarian governments sure might not be elections, but they buy off and they quell off opposition by pursuing policies that appease to the average civilian, right? So they need the stability for any chance at maybe potentially like liberalizing or potentially like using features that look reminiscent of democracy, even if they aren't explicitly democratic, right? Notice that benevolent dictators in specific are more likely to do this, even if they aren't qualitatively as free or qualitatively as fair as actual democracies. We think this is enough of a metric to meet in terms of why benevolent dictatorships are likely to remain benevolent in the future, right? There are many cases of dictatorships that have the presence of things like councils or maybe even host elections, even if those elections don't actually materially translate into anything, which shows that there is a revealed preference and a strong incentive for these dictatorships to adopt different features in their society in order to preserve the society being able to be benevolent in dictatorships, right? You have many cases of benevolent dictatorships that have, for instance, private markets because they understand that if they centralize and monopolize everything under state control, that means that it is much easier to unravel and unwind those things. So obviously these dictatorships have like the gift of like hindsight. Historically, they understand how dictatorships are unwinded, how dictatorships fall. I think these dictators are probably very, very strategic and probably very, very smart. Where then does this take us in terms of long-term weighing? I think in terms of long-term weighing, this shows that benevolent autocracies are better for a couple of reasons. First, democratic principles, and this kind of like cross applies to the principle too, so I guess I'm getting to that a little bit early, but democratic principles don't necessarily matter when democracies are already compromising these values, right? This is why the state power principle that they give to you in first isn't fully applicable here, because OP has to prove that these democratic mechanisms in a underperforming democracy can still fulfill their principle. You need to prove that protests can actually move the envelope in terms of influencing public servants and politicians to change what they do in terms of policy, right? But there are a couple of reasons we've already established why this is unlikely the case and why it's specifically exacerbated by underperforming democracies. Wealth and lobbying, disenfranchisement in terms of certain voter blocks or certain groups or populations of the electorate, and notably a tyranny of a majority in the sense that there was never a full scope of representation in these democracies in the regard that in a lot of these cases, these democracies are not aggregating the preference of every single voter. They're aggregating the preference of the most activated voters or the most frequent voters that are turning out and projecting their interest and projecting their influence into the state. Second thing to talk about very quickly then in terms of long-term stability, right? I want to note that I think benevolent dictatorships have far better conditions to loosen grip on power and invite some checks, for instance, things like councils or the presence of parties or hosting elections, even if they don't have real impact, than currently failing democracies do at recovering and strengthening institutions again in the future. I think there are two reasons why this is true. Firstly, because democratic backsliding stokes a lot of moral panic. You have to think about this in the context of someone that exists purely in like a liberal democratic society that all all of a sudden seems to be inviting features of fascism or features of authoritarianism. This stokes a huge degree of moral panic in people that oftentimes leaves them feeling as though if they cannot resort to or refer to institutions in order to reel back in and safeguard the checks and balances of power that exist in their society, and there is no meaningful alternative for them to be able to actually influence the state and change the trajectory of what the state does. The second thing, though, is that I think that there's like a good amount of fatigue that happens in a lot of these cases, right? When you start to realize that protests and civil rights are no longer able to pressure the government into different action, right? The comparative on our side of the house is very, very simple. One, I think the context we established you shows that even in the worst cases in which a benevolent dictatorship does devolve into maybe a more benevolent version of a state or a more benevolent version of the government, people are aware of the tactics, people are aware of the necessary things that need to be done in order to influence the state towards a different trajectory or a better trajectory, which is something that doesn't exist in the case of underperforming or backsliding democracies. They tend to capitalize scapegoating on certain in and out groups and exacerbating those problems by internalizing them and turning them towards other groups that functionally have like nothing to do with the actual feelings of that society, right? The second reason, though, is that I think, given what I've already explained about the fact that a lot of these benevolent autocrats have the gift of hindsight, they're pretty smart. They understand the strategies that have been used against autocracies in the past, and they invite the presence of some kind of features within their system, even if the system at large is centralized. I think this proves why it is less likely that a benevolent autocracy is likely to devolve into a more authoritarian government, because they have the institution of these checks and they have that long-term incentive that spans across leadership and spans across succession, right? That is to say that benevolent autocrats are centralizing power to create stable conditions in the country and have incentives to liberalize in some ways to preserve that stability. For instance, the existence of things like markets, right? The next thing I want to note here, though, is that continuing autocratic governments are just much easier to dispose of, right? This is because the West hates benevolent dictatorships. There's a history of Western intervention and coups. It's why they install dictatorships themselves as long as they support Western interests. This is the analysis for why dictators are likely smart about how they run the country. They want the country to be coup-proof. This means these loyalties are going to be loyalties that are bound to the interest of the country, or bound to keeping power like within a stable group of like elites for that country. But those elites have incentives that are generally good for the well-being of the citizenry in that country, because they don't want to have massive changes in leadership or massive instability that harms their own personal interests and incentives, right? The last and final thing I want to note here is that weak democracies cannot enforce democratic standards because their institutions are either compromised or corroded, right? And because of this means that you cannot win on democracy fundamentally in terms of opposition's push here. The last and final thing I want to talk about is more specifically in terms of the principle, right? I want to note that in terms of their principle argument in the debate, I think the reason why they can't win on the principle is because of two specific lines, right? Firstly, is that in underperforming democracies, these principal values can't be met if the actual mechanisms of democracy that are used to meet these principal values are something that are characteristically being undermined. This means in order for them to access winning this principal argument, they need to prove that either A, these institutions can still make deliverables to people in the moment, or B, that these institutions will be restored. Not only that these institutions will be restored, but that people's trust and faith in those institutions will actually return. For all these reasons, very, very proud to propose.
All right. I thank the third opposition speaker for that excellent speech, and I would like to welcome the third opposition speaker to open the op block. Yeah, speech not to exceed 8 minutes. Okay. I'll engage in this debate on 3 levels. Firstly, and as you can probably predict if you know me, why the principal easily wins the round. Secondly, on which system is most likely to backslide. And thirdly, on which system is best able to meet people's needs. One really quick note on the framing, because I think that proposition did a lot of work in this debate to gain themselves as much ground as possible, as far as making their dictatorships as benevolent as possible and making our democracies as underperforming as possible. But like, guys, this is a world schools debate, right? Like, the whole point is to be charitable and to engage in a harder debate. I think given that is the point, there is likely a reasonable trade-off, right? Which, like, I can choose country A or country B. Country A gives me a little bit greater right to vote and maybe a little bit less of my material needs, think the United States, for example, and country B gives me a little bit less of a right to vote, but meets those needs a little bit more. So there's an equal trade-off that happens on either side of the house. I'll explain to you why you should vote for our side of that trade-off, not this like weird comparative that we hear getting set up on their side. So Like I said, principle first. I think the principle of democracy wins easily. Let's first establish exactly what the principle is before looking at the way that proposition went about engaging in it within this debate. Firstly, on our principle, I think that there's two general things to note. I think it's a quite intuitive argument. The first is that given how extremely powerful the government is, given the unique level of coercive leverage they have over the citizen, insofar as they control things like your life and death, because they control the military and the army, they can steal your money because they control things like the taxes. They literally control the air that you breathe because they control the environmental policy. This all means the government has an unbelievable amount of leverage over you. And that the only way to ever check back meaningfully against that is to decide which things the government does, which needs the government does and doesn't meet. The second thing that we told you that there is an asymmetric access to information. That is to say that on their side of the house specifically, in these benevolent dictatorships, even if they are meeting your needs, perhaps, even maybe you are able to put food on the table, what you can't access is actual information. How, like, are people getting food put on the table? Are there democratic challenges to your dictatorships? Because within these dictatorships, they control the very information that you access. They control the very reality that you perceive. So that's the argument that we set up, right? How did proposition engage after that? Generally, they told you, but guys, other needs matter more. I care more about healthcare and food. And like, let me not gaslight, that's a pretty reasonable argument. But I don't think they actually engage in the sort of nuance that we give you. A couple things to respond directly before outweighing their argument. The first thing to note is that this argument in and of itself is hung because we're giving you a claim as to why your right to vote uniquely creates a certain level of value that cannot be unmatched. But they didn't meet their side of the burden, which is why food and the other things, etc., are so important. Secondly, is I think that we've explained to you why the vote specifically changes people's behavior or changes government's behavior. They have a preemptive incentive to meet people's needs because the barrier to there being backlash, them being ousted for power, is far, far lower. Unlike their side of the house, like there has to be like a successful armed rebellion. Thirdly, all that they really did with the refutation was establish a weighing question. That is, what matters more, the right to vote or meeting your needs? I think that Ryan answered this question in the previous speech and they didn't keep up. So why do we, I think, easily outweigh their arguments in this debate? Three reasons why our principle outweighs. Firstly, their best chance at winning this is by winning on stability. If they like their argument generally has been like, but like you're underperforming, the democracy backslides anyway, our government more stable, so we meet people's needs. But the problem is that you can't engage on a principle with stability of all things, right? I.e., whenever Haiti was declaring independence, right, against France, you could have said, bro, your government won't be stable. You will be invaded by Britain, by Spain, by France. You can't meet economic need. This can't be stable, guys. But what do we say? No, we don't recognize that. We recognize that your right to democracy, your right to liberation and freedom is in itself so large that it matters more than literally everything else. This is the sort of similar principle weighing that we've outlined to you as to why the right to vote and the right to democracy is so crucial. And I think they've actually meaningfully engaged this on the principle level in and of itself. I think that at their best ground of what Helen talks to you about, right, about like the alternative isn't like a super benevolent democracy. I think that in that case, the way that their benevolent dictatorship manifests is one which still excludes racial and ethnic minorities, is probably still not the best of them anyway. So I think if there's backsliding, it's probably going to happen on either side. The second reason that we outweigh is because Sophie explicitly explains to you that we create value through autonomy. Because you like what we explained to you said there's like no technocratic objective answer to the decision the government makes. You can't say abortion and like gay rights matter more than one thing, or that matters more than food or water or health or whatever it might be. I think these are all decisions that people make in and of themselves through the way that they live their lives and through the votes that they make. And through the votes that they make. I think that insofar as this is the case, it doesn't matter if their benevolent dictatorship is meeting needs, if these are the needs that people want to be met. And the reason that needs matter, the reason that we give them so much value and significance is because people like want them in the first place. It's this autonomy and desire that makes something valuable in the first place. Given that is the case, that we give people the means through which to like exercise this autonomy, even if it might be slow and inefficient, I think that means that the actual value they get back on it is actively is better. But even if you don't buy that argument, I think the inverse is true because we've explained that in benevolent dictatorships in which there is no free press, no like free democracy, you can't challenge the people who are in power, there is sort of negative value creation that happens. That is that you're living in fear. You think, I can't challenge my government. They are too powerful. They have all this leverage over me. And thus, even if your needs are being met, you don't enjoy them as much because the government is powerful and controlling you and sort of causes you to live your life in fear in this way. Because once again, autonomy and perception create value. If you've bought nothing else, I think it sets a very high burden on the practical level. They have to prove that they actually meaningfully avoid backsliding and meet people's needs in order to beat our principle. Before engaging on those questions directly, I'll take a POI if there is one. Awesome. Okay, so which system is the most likely to backslide? This engages with Helen's characterization of when benevolent dictatorships arise. Sure, Helen.
So you talk about this principle a lot, but how does the principle of representation stand when it's like representation of 10 to 40% of the people?
I think so. All the direct answer that I have to that is I think that just having the choice to like influence the government at all in itself outweighs that. If you buy the argument that's been given you before, the benevolent dictatorship probably only represents the autonomy of a very small select people, right? So I think that our democracy up layers on that level. So why do I think the backside is more likely on their side of the house? Two reasons. Firstly, power corrupts. This beats Helen's weighing on like dictatorship as it corrects democracy. Because if I am a dictator and I'm a benevolent one and I have sole control over power and I think I am the smart one, I am the one that knows how to give people water, give people food, meet people's needs, those are exactly the predicaments in which they cling to power even when they no longer should, which means that the transition to democracy or whatever that proposition talks to you about literally never happens because they don't engage on the power corruption analysis that we give you from the start. Ebenezer and Hans say, but they just meet civilians' needs. But one's what happens when they can't. In the one we told you that there's times you simply can't. There's economic downturns. You get sanctioned by the West. Who knows what? When the government can't meet your needs, then that's when violent revolts happen, and that's when the worst outcomes happen. Secondly, I think that dictators turn to other options instead of meeting people's needs. Do things like disappearances, repressions. This is why in the 1980s, Guatemala, when it was economically starving, went to Reagan and got this unlimited aid, and then used that to repress every single leftist who just wanted more water. I think these are the options that people opt for on their side whenever you have dictatorships that don't have democratic backlash. On our side, we have the sorts of alternative democratic institutions being built, sort of culture being built up that allow for other systems to be built. The third point of clash in 10 seconds is that they never respond to our argument on investment flight. We said that companies don't trust dictatorships, they don't trust their black box regulations, and they will always leave any country which they perceive to be too dictatorship-y or too illiberal because they fear backlash. This means that even if they're right about the incentives of their governments and their capacity, they don't have any funding necessary or things like that to meet people's needs. We do that to the private sector on our side. Proud to oppose. I thank the third opposition speaker for that decent speech and would like to welcome the fourth opposition speaker to close the op bench. Hear, hear.
Excellent. Three points in this speech. First, the clash on quality of policy. Second, the clash on regime stability. Finally, the clash on principle. First, on policy quality. The best argument from proposition is a basket of reasons why democracies tend to implement subpar policies. Maybe that's due to lobbying, maybe that's due to short-termism, maybe that's due to corruption, maybe that's due to capture by elites. All of this is reasonable mitigation in establishing that democracies pass imperfect policy, and it's probably fair that the best case scenario for prop, think Singapore for instance, passes reasonably good policy. However, the main argument in favor of democracy, insufficiently rebutted by prop, is that democracy minimizes the tail risk of the very worst policies being implemented. The causal risk with a dictatorship is that there is no system of checks and balances in place. So even if 85 or 90% of the policies passed by a benevolent dictator are good at enhancing economic growth and establishing social cohesion, the catastrophic risk, that 10% probability of passing a policy that results in vast deaths of innocent people, that results in famine as a consequence of misallocation of resources, that results in the complete disruption of trade ties or a foreign intervention to change the regime. Is there an echo or is that just me? Oh, beautiful. We all good now. That risk outweighs the benefits of proposition for two reasons. First, they're prior. Suppose it is true that the average benevolent dictatorship, maybe Singapore being the only example, passes very good policies 9 times out of 10. The problem is that the one instance where dictators err, either due to a lack of accountability or due to a lack of information, never rebutted by prop, the catastrophic implications of those policies of wrecking the economy of Mao-style famine is itself more important than the benefits of persistently good economic policy, because you wipe away whatever benefits have been accrued over the course of previous good economic policies. So it's true, the average democracy might not pass excellent policies, but there's a reason why no functioning democracy has ever had a famine. And the reason is because the average democracy protects against the worst sorts of policies. You should weigh this debate on preventing the worst sorts of harms. And the reason is because both teams agree that the biggest problem in the debate is turning your state into an outright authoritarian dictatorship with bad incentives. And that is most likely to happen when you have terrible economic mismanagement. That is more likely to happen in the extreme cases on prop, which is why you would rather have persistently mediocre policy on op than the risk of catastrophe on prop. Severity weighing means you vote op. Ballot 2, backsliding. So both sides agree that either system is probably better than a benevolent dictatorship. And so the question then is, which regime is relatively more stable? There are two ways that regimes can backslide into malicious dictatorship. The first is direct backsliding in the form of Hungary on our side, or maybe Turkey in prop's world. It's possible that there's a margin on this clash, but it's probably insubstantial. Maybe it's true that some dictatorships become more democratic over time or become less democratic. Maybe it's true that your average democracy becomes somewhat more authoritarian. Maybe voters push for stronger democratic infrastructure. That clash is a wash. The clash that opposition wins conclusively on are the asymmetric risks of regime collapse. And this is where the benevolent dictatorship arguments die, because if the benevolent dictatorial regime plunges into civil war or a succession crisis, prop gets no benefits, but people die. So why is conflict more likely on their side? First, the argument on civil war from '02 that is mishandled by prop. The fact that rentier states depend on resources means conflict is more likely to break out and more likely to be prolonged. They say democracies have conflict because you can't meet basic needs. But one, this is preempted explicitly by op because we explain the positive incentives to protect people's basic rights. But more importantly, we also explain that the reason violence happens less in democracies, even in flawed democracies, is because violence is risky and costly. You don't use violence unless you have no other alternative, which is what you have on their side. Secondly, there is no effective response to the succession crisis argument. Even if the benevolent dictatorship has perfectly good incentives, it cannot stop reality. The dictator will die or be ousted from power. That risk is much greater on their side, and the risk of outright backsliding is enough to win off the debate, hence oppose.
I thank the opposition reply for that excellent speech, and I'd like to welcome the government reply to close not just the government bench, but the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
I found it pretty rich when opposition's third speaker said that we lost this debate because we are afraid of the clash, when I feel the exact same way about their side of the house. In fact, the second speaker even said that people have a revealed preference for democracy over benevolent dictatorships. What were his examples in that speech, you might ask? Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad, and Xi Jinping. Some of the history's most brutal war criminals. Meanwhile, opposition bench minimizes the severity of democracy's underperformance by ignoring the climate debate and claiming that underperforming democracies are not the same thing as backsliding ones. In this speech, I'm going to explain to you why proposition wins clearly on the principled and pragmatic side, beginning with the principled question: which form of government best upholds the human dignity of its citizens? This is the place where most of the debate has taken place, but we get two different depictions of what constitutes a person's human dignity, right? Opposition tells us that human dignity is equal to two things: consent of the governed and civil liberties. Here's the problems. From the very first speech onward, opposition's arguments were entirely unresponsive to our case and a few line of argumentations that were carried through by Helen and Ebenezer. First, structural inequality deprives specific groups, i.e. racial minorities or religious minorities, of the very consent mechanisms opposition says are the only way a citizen can consent into being governed. Remember that through the opposition bench, they have told you that this principle argument is the most important clash in this debate. They're going to lose it. Examples of this: violence at the polls in India that prevent Muslim minorities from actually expressing their right to vote, or gerrymandering and voter roll purges in the United States that systemically target Black voters because the GOP doesn't want them to express their voice. And secondly, corruption destroys any semblance of loyalty or obligation that representatives owe their constituents. So what this means at the end of the day is that democracies use elections as a tool to placate placate the population, not to listen to them, all the while knowing that it is a sham democracy. You can't consent if you're being lied to. And finally, a corrupt and unequal democracy caught in an endless gridlock is likely to evolve into the very kind of autocracy opposition is so deathly afraid of. Checks and balances fail to stop the transition from democracy to oligarchy when court justices like Clarence Thomas receives vacation homes as gifts, or politicians who will drown a litter of kittens for a few bucks to their next campaign are the ones making decisions. An underperforming democracy is a backsliding democracy. I'm not crazy for saying this. It's literally happening in every single democracy in the world. In the United States, multiple members of Congress were arrested. Children were deported without due process, and the US military was deployed to suppress ICE protests in LA. So don't talk to me about how benevolent dictatorships are the only ones that disrespect checks and balances and civil liberties. You're not winning on the principled clash. On the pragmatic clash, which version of the state is most likely to be sustainable? The key thing here is an incentive analysis. We told you that democracies are short-sighted because policies are tied to election cycles. Any progress made on child poverty or clean energy production is immediately rolled back by the next regime, whereas benevolent dictatorships can identify structural vulnerabilities, establish a consistent strategy, and actually follow through. Guys, that would be so nice if we could follow through on a strategy instead of every 4 years policy priorities being flipped completely upside down. What this means is that rentier states can move from dependency on resources, circumventing their arguments about how resource states are likely to fall into violence, into diversification. That's why countries like the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, are investing in nuclear energy, which is something we have tried to do for decades, but are still so far behind on. Remember that the previous speaker just told you that democracies reduce the likelihood of the worst policies from being implemented. Well, I tell you that climate change is an existential threat that gets exponentially worse every single day we don't do something about it. Paralysis might seem safer, but it's not. So proud to propose.
Awesome. Thank you, Proposition Reply, and thank you to everyone for an excellent debate. Like I said at the beginning, I really appreciate you all being here. It wouldn't be possible without all of you. So thank you. And that concludes the recording of the 2025 demo round.